We wanted to just thank you so much for coming tonight to discuss this very important issue. We would welcome you to move forward, if you're comfortable or not. But anyway, we really want to thank Mayor Lorza and Nicole Pollock for coming tonight to talk to you about the city's finances. It's something that the elephant in the room is the $1 billion unfunded pension liability. It's very, very important, I think, for the city, the residents of our city, to understand exactly what the finances are and the urgency of this issue. So I think you're going to learn a lot from this presentation tonight. We have a lot of protesters. And we are going to ask if you would be so kind as to just allow the mayor and Nicole to make their presentation tonight. They're going to have plenty of time for people to speak and ask questions. And so I know there are a lot of people that are opposed to the privatization, which is not exactly what they're planning tonight, of the Providence water supply. But there's going to be plenty of time to talk about that. We just don't want anyone to be shouting over each other, because there are people who have taken the time to come out tonight to learn about these very, very important issues.
And I also want to thank Rep. Rebecca Kislak and Rep. Jello for being here, and former Councilman Sam Zurier as well for being here. So these conversations have been going on for quite some time. Many of my constituents have brought it up on several occasions at some of our community meetings. Not only is this an opportunity to hear the proposal, but it's also important for all of you to provide your input, because the decision that will be made should include the community. And I'm happy that all of you are here, and we look forward to hearing your concerns, your input, and hopefully all this information can help the administration move forward in making the best decision, not only to prioritize the financial stability of our city, as they have been, but also to make sure that we are prioritizing our water, because it is an asset, and we want to make sure that it's protected. So thank you again for being here.
And I think we also, our state rep, Rebecca Kislak, would like to say a quick word.
Hi, thank you everybody for being here. Our city is such a treasure and the heart of our state, and I am hoping that we can all listen to this conversation and also widen the conversation a little bit as well. Our city finances are, well, we'll hear more about them. We need to do better. We need to shore them up, and we need to have a city-state partnership to make that happen in a bunch of ways, which is why I'm looking forward to listening and working together with community and with my colleagues up at the State House to help make sure that Providence can succeed well into the future.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, and thank you so much for being part of this conversation. I want to thank Councilwoman Anthony and Councilwoman LaFortune. I also want to thank Rep. Agella and Rep. Kislak for being here for part of the conversation. So essentially what we want to talk about today is going to be broken down into two parts. The first one is the city's finances, and second is the proposal that we put forth to solve some of the challenges that we have. On the first one, I think it's really important for us to continue to talk about this. We have some major and serious challenges. Now the trick, right, and part of the challenge that we have on the administration side is that we have a lot of really positive news to share about the progress we've made with our finances. Most of that progress is with respect to our short-term finances. So on the one hand, we're having record surpluses. We're also creating a rainy day fund, paying off the deficit, budgeting responsibly, having our credit rating upgraded. So all of that is great. But how can we square this while at the same time talking about this looming financial challenge that's off into the future? I hope that when we walk out of the room today, folks will have a clearer understanding of how both of those things can be true. how our finances can be short over the short term, but still have a looming threat over the long term. The second reason why I think it's important for us to continue to have this conversation is because no one knows exactly when those long-term challenges are going to become so acute that receivership and bankruptcy are back on the table as an imminent possibility. It could be 10 years, it could be 15 years, no one knows exactly when. But I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that the longer that we wait, the more serious and more acute that imminent threat is going to become, but also the more difficult it is going to be for us to do something about it. So what we're hoping to do is continue to sound the alarm and raise awareness of those challenges so that we can act now. So that's one part of the conversation for today. The second part of the presentation is not just ringing the alarm and alerting us to the challenges, but also proposing a real, tangible, earnest solution that we're putting forward. Now, this solution is massively complicated politically, financially, politically, and or logistically. So it's incredibly complicated, and we want to share with you why we think this is the best solution. In fact, not just it being the best solution, but simply remembering that in situations like this, there is no ideal outcome, there is no ideal solution. And frankly, being mayor of the city of Providence, sometimes the choice is which of all the possible outcomes is less worse. And so I'm happy to answer any questions as we get going into the presentation of perhaps folks have ideas, well, will this work? Will that work? Have you considered this? Have you considered that? I want you to know that all of this has been informed by years and years of work, not only by administrations and city councils before this administration came in, but as soon as we took office, we commissioned a 160-page report by the National Resource Network. And they presented the challenges with a number of different solutions, and all of that is publicly available. We had about 35 stakeholders in the community that helped inform it. I also want to recognize Councilman Sam Zurier, who's been a leading voice on this for quite a while, and he, on his role in the city council, led a committee to also study this issue. So there's a wealth of knowledge there that has also informed our thinking, and of course, this has been talked about in the community for quite a while, going back at least a couple of decades. So that's the second part of the presentation. In order to do the presentation, we're going to be led by the Chief of Staff, Nicole Pollock, who I'll hand the microphone over to right now. And after she's done, we also have a panel of folks in my administration. I have my Director of Finance, I have my City Solicitor, and also my Director of Sustainability. So if there are any technical questions that come from the audience on the finances, on the legal aspects, or on the environmental side of it, we also have the leading directors from my administration here to answer any questions. So once again, thank you very much for being a part of this conversation, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. I just wanted to quickly review one more thing, and then I'll actually get into it. I know you've gotten a lot of introductions and information. We are going to do a Q&A at the end. We've handed out note cards so that if questions come up while the presentation is happening that you're afraid you might forget, feel free to write them down, and if you don't want to ask the question, we're happy to take your note card and we'll aggregate them at the end, and if there are themes from the different comments or questions, we'll look at those and try to answer all of those questions or comments at the end as well. So it looks like Teresa's handing them out, so raise your hand, both of you need them, or if you have one and you'd like one of our staff members to pick them up. Okay, I'm going to jump in. Okay, so where we were is pre-Elorza administration. I came to work for the city for Mayor Elorza, so I'm not super familiar with all of the executive decisions that happened before that. But where we were before is high tax rates. We still have high tax rates, and again, that's likely to continue if we don't have a really earnest conversation about this issue. Limited funding for schools and infrastructure. This is obvious probably to all of you who walk into a public building or a school building because your children go to the public schools or you're participating in some public activity. We need to do better. The schools need to be in better condition, and part of that is unlocking some additional capacity within the city to make those investments. Constrained ability to provide services, this is tied to that as well. When we have a low bond rating, which I note next, we have a hard time borrowing money to be able to make investments throughout the city. We had no rainy day funds, so we had no ability, if there was a crisis that occurred, we had no dollars put aside to address the crisis. Most cities have a rainy day fund. We had none before we came in. And we had, and we still do, a looming unfunded pension liability. This is our $1 billion problem, and that is what we're here to talk to you about this evening. How did we get here? So you're saying, well, it sounds fairly irresponsible, and there are a series of decisions that brought us to this point. I'll talk about two of them. One of them is the city agreed in the early 90s to provide retirees with 5% and 6% COLAs, which are cost of living adjustments. That basically means that every year your retirement goes up 5 to 6%. I gave an example here. If you retired at a $50,000 salary and you got $30,000 in retirement, 15 years later, I think we're at 1981, 2001, 2012, so 20 years later, you're at $102,000 per year in your retirement. That's a very significant increase, and it's not one that the city can afford. The second thing that happened is the city did not make its full pension payments for 17 out of the 18 years in the 90s and early 2000s. So basically, we weren't paying our full mortgage, our full credit card bill, whatever you have it. So the interest has continued to accrue, the balance has continued to go up, and the funding status has continued to go down. We are now at a point where we are close to 25% funded for a pension that should be funded at 70%, 60 or 70% or better. One thing I'll note is if we had made all of those payments on time in the 90s and early 2000s, we would not be here having this conversation with you because the pension would be funded somewhere between 55 and 70%. Not perfect, but good enough for a public pension system. Here's just an overview of the unfunded pension liability. What you can see is it basically, sorry the numbers are blurry, but this is from the, again, early 90s to current day. You'll see that the numbers continue to go down in the funded status as the liability increases. So this is just basically illustrating how it balloons over the course of time. So what have we done to fix it? The mayor alluded to this, but I want to talk through a few short-term things that we have done. First, we've had operating surpluses for the past 3 years. We attribute this to better budgeting and also a better economy. This has allowed us to make some investments in our rainy day fund, like I talked about before, and also our healthcare fund. So we do have a balance now in a fund to protect the city's finances if we're in an emergency. We still need to build up those reserves further. They should be at around 5% of your operating budget. We're nowhere close to that at this point, but we're getting there. We've erased the cumulative deficit as well. We have shown balanced budgets in our 5-year projection, so the next 5 years out, the city actually looks like it's in fairly okay shape. Again, assuming state funding stays the same, assuming we don't change the tax structure, so you're going to continue to see taxes slowly increase over time. And we've also made 100% of our retirement payments. We've also improved our credit ratings. Why does this matter? This is like having a really good credit score, right? You get better deals for credit cards. You're more likely to get loans for your home or for other things that you would like loans for. So the city at this point has improved its credit rating, but as you can see, we're not at like A+ status up there. We're an improved outlook, but we still could do a whole lot better. The way we do a whole lot better is addressing our unfunded pension liability. Why does this matter? Again, if we're going to continue to make investments, the investment world that makes those investments need to think that we're a secure deal. Right now, we're considered to be a fairly risky deal, though getting better. Okay, we've improved our business climate. I just pulled a quick overview of some of the permit fees that the city has taken in over the past few years. Those have increased almost threefold to what they were in the previous decade. So we've seen a huge healthy growth in the economy in the city. You probably see this when you drive around. There's new developments happening, homes being renovated. It brings its own host of other challenges related to affordable housing, which is not something we're here to talk about tonight, but definitely a conversation that needs to be had. And we will be having with the community, but it is really good for our numbers and for our business climate. What we've also done is implemented a long-term capital planning process. This might sound obvious, but when we came into office, we didn't know when the next planned road investment or sidewalk investment or when the next investment in our city buildings or rec centers, schools was going to happen because there was no plan in place for that. Most cities have a 5-year or 10-year capital plan that they use so that even if they don't completely follow it, there's at least a guidebook for what needs to happen. And it also helps drive regular maintenance of things like roads, sidewalks, so that when a crack appears, it's filled and the road lasts a few years longer. And that's what we've put in place. So the city put in a capital plan 3 years ago and is now bonded against that plan twice, which basically means we financed it twice, and we'll continue to put that practice in place throughout our departments and throughout the city. The goal with that practice is to improve our road conditions, improve our sidewalks, improve our public schools, improve our rec centers, all the things that you experience in the public realm of the city. Again, we're still at the very beginning of this. It's going to take a long time for this to come to fruition and for everyone to see the results, but it's a practice that we've committed ourselves to. One piece I'm excited to talk about is with the capital planning process on the school side, we were able to leverage the state investment, and then voters in the city voted for a city-side school bond. We have put a $310 million application into the Rhode Island Department of Education for improvements to schools in the next 5 years, and we're actually pulling a plan together for a $500 million investment in our schools. I will note that only scratches the surface. Our schools need even more than that, but this is the first long-term, very large investment that we've been looking at in a few decades. So these are some of the practices we've been putting in place that were recommended through that report that the mayor talked about to help deal with our major long-term financial and city challenges. I forgot to check. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. So pension reform. People ask us a lot or say, hey, why don't you do pension reform? And the answer is we actually did do pension reform. So in 2012, the city went through a pension reform process under the Tavares administration. Through that pension reform, those COLAs that I talked about, those cost of living expenses that drove up 5 to 6% every year, those were frozen until 2023. And we also changed healthcare benefits for retirees as well. So we made some major gains in that pension reform, but we did not fix all the problems that are before us. It helped fix some major short-term problems the city had in terms of finances, but again, those COLAs come back in 2023, and we have continued, and also assumes that we're going to continue to get the same amount of funding from the state, and it assumes that taxes continue to rise. I guess I could talk about, I want to just note a few other things that happened. Cicilline administration reinstated the full pension payments that I mentioned before. That's when those came back into play. Tavares administration did the same pension reform, and now what we're doing is some of those short-term things, continuing to make full pension payments and having this bigger conversation with you about our longer-term finances. Okay, I think I talked through this. So one thing, again, we hear about is, well, why don't you do pension reform for current and future employees? Why don't you change your benefit structure for teachers, for municipal staff, fire, and police? What this graph illustrates is that that wouldn't have a huge impact, and at this point, we are considered to be average to low in the competitiveness scale for those types of jobs. As a mid-sized city that needs excellent service and staff, we can't keep chipping away at employee benefits. But what you can see here is, you can't quite see, so I'll just say, this is the amount of our pension payment that goes towards retirees, so people who already are retired. This is the percentage, this is about 10%, it's 9.8%, that goes to current and future employees. So when we're making that payment, that's how that breaks down. Most of the payment, 90% of the payment, is going to retirees. So the point I'm trying to make there is our biggest issue is with people who are no longer in unions or part of collective bargaining agreements. So even if we take that on, we move the needle, but only so slightly. So, and it is something we've taken on, so I guess I'm going to talk about the other pieces. We have reduced leave and some benefits for our staff. We also have changed our health benefits significantly for every group of municipal employees. In the fire department, we reduced minimum manning. I made some pretty major shifts in all of our contracts as recommended again by that report that the mayor referenced. I want to note, we keep talking about this thing, the NRN report. If you're saying, what is this mystical document? On our website, we have a link to a page that goes an overview on this and that particular report and a few of the other pension reports that are done, if you want to look at that.
Can you give the name of that again, please?
Yep, sorry. It's the National Resource Network, and they did a long-term financial plan for the city. And if you can Google it, or you can go to our website and you'll find it. We also have looked at increasing taxes and fees. What I'm noting right after that is those increases on an annual basis have an impact of about $500,000 to about $2 million per year. I note that because we would have to probably increase or create 5 or 10 new taxes to be able to get the amount that we would need annually to have an impact on this issue. So we've actually looked at increasing the hotel tax, which the city gets a small share of, and we actually introduced a bill and it was not successful on this. We also looked at the meal and beverage tax increase, again requires state approval, did not get a warm reception. We also explored a parking tax. We've looked at taxing nonprofits, which I'll talk about in a second. And we've also increased, to some extent, our pilot dollars from nonprofit institutions. The legislation related to nonprofits, because this comes up a lot, what we put in is legislation that would tax non-mission essential parcels at a commercial rate. So for instance, if you're a nonprofit and you own a parcel that a restaurant that's making profit is using, or maybe you have a coffee shop, that particular building or square footage would be taxed at a commercial rate. To be fair, a lot of our nonprofits do that already. Brown is one that holds all of its for-profit buildings in a separate company, and they do pay taxes. But again, this is an area where we could make some gains, but it wouldn't be super significant. It probably would be something between $1 to $2 million per year. Are there other alternatives? There are, I talked about some of them, but it's increasing taxes and fees for residents, decreasing the quality of city services, so we could definitely, we could potentially cut city services further. That is an option, but again, that comes with a decrease in service and probably a decrease in some of the planning and long-term strategy pieces that I just talked about. Decrease in school investments, as we all know, this is just not an option. The city needs to be investing more in its schools, both its buildings and in the instruction that's provided within the walls of those buildings. We owe that to ourselves, our kids, the future of the city. And then decrease parks and recreation opportunities, so stopping and reducing our investments in outdoor spaces that we own. These are really the areas that we control and have an opportunity to potentially reduce, but again, these are not propositions or not things that we want to really look further into without looking at other solutions. So that's an overview of the city's finances and why we have a $1 billion problem and kind of what we're trying to do to address that problem. What I want to do is move into kind of the water conversation. I'm partially separating it because we know that this part of the conversation, again, is more controversial and is a part of the conversation that we'll have a lot of discussion about. But again, we've looked at a lot of these smaller interventions, and both politically, they're not something we're getting a lot of support for, and two, you have to do so many of them that we'd have to have success implementing probably legislative changes to actually move the needle, and that would require a pretty magnificent change from where we are now. So, oopsies. Teresa, do you want to restart the presentation? Oh, there we go. Okay, there we go. I pushed the wrong thing. So why Providence Water? I mean, this is probably my point more than probably the thing I care most about when presenting this is your tax dollars should go to city services. I live in the south side of the city. I see a lot of faces from around the city. Most of your tax dollars, a big portion of them don't go to providing services to you and your family. They go to providing a pension payment. And while it's a liability that we're obligated to pay, we should be paying for the services that, again, our families and children deserve. Providence Water, again, I talked about this before, a combination of the options, increasing fees, decreasing services. The ones I talked about before don't move the needle enough to have an impact on this challenge or this problem. Providence Water is the only one that unlocks the assets, the money that we need now without losing control of our assets. So I'll just kind of preface this for a second. The city did an evaluation of Providence Water, and it was valued at current value at around $400 million. That is not necessarily what we would do a transaction at. That is just what its value is, in its current state. But I wanted to illustrate a transaction or a point because one of the pieces of feedback we got at other presentations is that we weren't providing a concrete enough example for people to wrap their heads around. That being said, I want you to know we're not entering a transaction right now. There is no pending relationship with any partner, and this is just for illustration purposes only. That being said, the asset could be valued at 300, at 400, 500, 600. Again, we don't know yet because we haven't pursued a partnership. We just know its current value, not as part of a partnership. So I'm going to use that as our base example. So let's assume in 2021, that's the number right here, we did a transaction where we entered into a long-term lease with an operator, maybe a 50-year lease. And part of that lease is they provide an upfront payment to us of $400 million, and we don't get any additional payments for that 50 years. We could do other arrangements. We could do a smaller upfront payment and annual payments after that. We could just do annual payments. But let's just run the scenario of putting $400 million into the pension, the $1 billion problem that we have. If we were to do that in 2021, we'd immediately drop the payments $30 million. And over the course of the next 10 to 15 years, the difference between the payment we would be paying if we didn't do this transaction and the amount we would be paying is up to $45 million per year. And that's annual, year over year. That is incredibly significant. What does that pay for? That pays for tax decreases or stabilization for our residents. The amount we could leverage in terms of borrowing for our schools. I mean, I can't overemphasize for you, $30 million to $45 million per year, annually, year over year in the city's budget is significant. And really the difference between unlocking some of the potential that exists in our public spaces and in the services that we want to provide to residents. This is why we are looking at this particular solution over others. It's the only one that moves the needle enough so that the payments smooth out and we're able to make the investments that we should be making in the city. How would it work? So I just kind of went over this, but you choose a partner, so we're not contemplating a sale of the asset. The reason why we're not contemplating a sale, which makes it less obviously attractive for potentially a private investor, is a few reasons, but the main one is we want to maintain the asset in the public's trust or as a public asset. There are a lot of reasons why it's important to keep a water system as owned fundamentally by the public, but we believe there's more oversight. Obviously, the Providence Water Board would stay in place, and it helps ensure that if anything were to, not be going the way we planned, you could pull back and we would continue to own and operate it. That being said, we're looking at a 30 to 50-year lease, or this is how it's often done. Most annual lease payments could yield the city about $4 to $8 million per year or more, depending on the structure. And what we would be requiring of a partner is a few things. First, they would be required to maintain the unionized workforce. So we would require any operator to keep the staff that we currently have in the union and maintain the union benefits of our employees. Maintain stable water rates. One thing that came up last time is the city has put a bill into the General Assembly to allow us to do this transaction. It does not tell us we have to. It is not the transaction. It just allows us to. And what that bill does is actually stabilizes rates for the first 5 years if we were to do a transaction, so they can go up no higher than the last 5 years. And all that really means is we're trying to show you that there's clear stabilization in that transaction. After that point, the PUC would come in, so the Public Utilities Commission, and they would regulate rates. The PUC currently regulates rates. Actually, there's a rate hearing next week for Providence Water, which is an annual practice. It's a regular practice. That practice would continue. We'd ensure quality of the water. Every water supplier is meant to maintain certain quality by Department of Health. That requirement and the quality would not change. We're not contemplating changing the water source, changing the distribution system, changing the infrastructure, planned infrastructure investments of the asset. So I talked through most of this, and I just want to continue to emphasize that Providence Water would still be owned by the city of Providence. Okay, so where does the money come from? Mainly economies of scale. So One thing that, we often, let me go through Providence Water's budget quickly. Providence Water has an $80 million budget. 35% of that budget is required to go to capital improvement. And the remainder of the budget goes to operating expenses. If you can realize economies of scale of even 10 to 15% in each of those categories, that's enough dollars to both pay the payment to the city and for the company to make a slight potential gain in terms of why they want to make the investment. They'd be realizing that efficiency. It'd be somewhere between $2 and $3 million a year that a company may be able to get from entering into a transaction. Historically, in these types of transactions, efficiencies can be between 10 and 40%. The reason why I'm giving you the lower end is because we would be putting a lot of restrictions and protections on the city's asset. We would not be allowing them to make a lot of changes. So that makes the transaction, quite frankly, and it may not even be something that anyone would want to enter into, but we're making it fairly unattractive, quite frankly, because we want to have rate control, quality controls, and employee controls. And again, this is why we're doing it, is because this delta is really the delta we need so that the pension payment doesn't continue to grow. It grows 3.5% every year, and every year that happens, that's less and less dollars that are going into city services and more dollars that are going to pay a pension liability that is only going to continue to grow. So I just want to emphasize a few points, and I think I'm done, but I do have I have a few FAQs after this. We really need to have a strong capital city to have a strong state. There's just no doubting that the economic success of the city very much impacts and affects the economic success of the state. So the mayor feels like it is very important that we explore all the options to ensure that the city is in good financial standing, not just while he's here, but when he's gone. Because this problem is really not going to be quite this administration's problem. It's going to be the problem of the next administration and the following administration after that. It's unsustainable for Providence to continue to oversee the water supply for 60% of the state. That is the service area of Providence Water. It's 60% of the users. The first year we put a piece of legislation into the General Assembly, we actually contemplated putting together a regional water supply that was a public entity that had seats for every community that was part of the water supply. Again, that's something that we would consider. We would sell that asset to that regional supply, and it would be another public oversight entity. We would consider doing something like that, but we really do need to think about a solution. And the last point I'll make is we have more options today than we will tomorrow. The more urgent our financial situation gets, the more dire it gets, the less time we have to be thoughtful about the decisions that we make about the city's long-term finances. So I'm going to quickly do these, and then we'll get into Q&A, and we're going to bring a panel up of our finance director, our city solicitor, and our sustainability director. So first, are we going to do Flint, Michigan? The answer is no. Flint, Michigan changed their water source. They flipped the switch from one water source and went to another water source. They had never tested that water source for their pipe system and did not know the quality of that water source. Providence would continue to use the Scituate Reservoir. It would not change the distribution channels. We wouldn't be doing anything remotely close to this. The Scituate Reservoir and the Providence water system is pristine and some of the best water in the region and the nation. That is not something that would change, and quite frankly, there is no other water source that we could switch to because the network is so big. So even if that's something that we were contemplating, which we are not, there isn't a secondary source that could serve Providence water customers. I heard that Providence water is going to be sold. We are not selling, we are not considering selling, we are looking at a partnership or a long-term lease. I feel like I need to emphasize that as much as possible. What is the actual transaction? Again, this is what I talked about before. We're looking at a long-term lease to an operator. So where has this kind of partnership worked throughout the country? We've looked at a lot of transactions nationally, and there are a lot of transactions in Pennsylvania, in the Midwest, in the West Coast, most of which we don't think they did a good job, or we think that they did partially a good job and other things they didn't do a good job on. Some of those agreements didn't put labor protections in place. They didn't put close enough rate caps in place. They didn't put quality controls in place the way they should have. So what we are doing is trying to learn from that so that if we were to do this, we would do the best job possible. So I don't want to paint a picture for you and then for you to Google and see. There's a lot of these things that have gone wrong. We fully admit that, and we are here because we want to have a conversation about how to do it right, and also note that we are going to employ experts to do this right if this is something that the city chooses to do. So there is no transaction around the country that I'm going to point to and say, we're going to do it just like that, because so far there's not a transaction that we're super excited about or a transaction that we think did it the way we would do it. That being said, we also are our own unique context. We have a pristine reservoir. We're not doing this for financial reasons right now, so we can put constraints on the transaction that other cities and towns were not able to, because they did this further down the road when their situation was more dire. Okay, I think that's everything for the presentation. So now if you guys wouldn't mind, I'm going to bring up our panelists, and we're going to have a Q&A, and I think one of who on staff and city staff is going to be, right, okay, we'll have someone walking around and providing a microphone so we can all hear the Q&A. But first I'm going to call up Larry Mancini, Director of Finance, Leah Bamberger, Director of Sustainability, and Jeff Dana, City Solicitor. Thank you for listening to my very long presentation. Okay.